Hi, class. Today I want to talk a little bit about modernism and postmodernism in order to prepare you for a little research assignment that I'm going to give you this week, where I'll give you each of you both a modernist mythologist as well as a postmodern mythologist, and have you do some research on on them, and then present that to the class via discussion briefly. And then following that, I'll have a Zoom in which students will be invited to participate if they like, or you can just watch the video afterwards, which I'll try to kind of fill in the gaps of what your presentations or discussion points kind of missed out on a little bit. And I'll give the instructions for that assignment in the announcements, and a little more about it at the end of this discussion, of this talk. But anyway, I want to talk, as I said, about modernism and postmodernism. As I mentioned in the last lecture, the study of mythology really has colonialist origins. It arises in the late 1800s. As this colonial project is spreading out all over the world, and we're discovering new stories, new myths, and these stories are being collected by people often with a colonialist agenda, oftentimes maybe a Christian agenda, and looking for confirmation of their beliefs and ideas in the myths of others. But in some cases, that's not true. Some of the early mythologists were just genuinely interested in these other cultures, and were studying them for the knowledge they could get from those cultures, even if that was used for kind of that colonial project of politicians and whatnot. It wasn't always the intention of the mythologists themselves. And so basically, when we talk about modernism, we're talking about that period on up to the mid part of the last century, on into the mid 50s, and even into the 60s a little bit. And this is what we refer to as the modernist period. This is what is referred to in literary studies, but also as sort of just a critical theory. We call it modernism. And there is much, much we could say about this that we don't have time to talk about. Um, it's a huge category, and so we're going to simplify things in this talk today, and then we'll kind of delve more deeply by looking at some modernist thinkers and juxtaposing those thinkers with postmodernist thinkers. Okay, but the first thing I want to say is that it's the best way to think about this is not two clashing worldviews fighting against one another. It's more like, say, if we're looking at physics, for example, Einstein's ideas, while they overturned a lot of Newton's ideas about gravity, it was through the study of Newton, because he was a student of Newton, etc., that he came upon his own ideas about relativity. So, in other words, all of the postmodernists were basically people who studied with these modernists and kind of took the discourse in a broader and sometimes a different direction. Okay, so in terms of modernism, um, and you'll get the thinkers, basically all of you will get first a modernist and then a postmodernist. So Freud, Jung, and some of the early uh, Joseph von Goethe, for example, and so forth. These are the modernist thinkers. And there are two things I want you to know about modernism. And like I said, there's much more to it than this, but two things primarily that I'd like you to take from this talk is that modernism is kind of concerned with essences and origins, right? So in modernism, there's a sense of a unified, centered self, for example. And the family is often presented as sort of central unit of the social order. Um, and there's often a faith and a personal investment in big politics, the nation state, or the Communist Party, or whatever. Okay, postmodernism basically breaks from those two things. There's a lot of overlap between the two, and you'll see some overlap in these thinkers. But for the most part, postmodernist thinkers reject both the significance and, often cases, even the existence of origins and essences. So for the postmodernists, they believe, for example, that even if the origin is discoverable, and one of the arguments postmodernists make is that those origins are really lost forever, that we'll never be able to trace things back to their origin anyway. But even if we could, it would be trivial. The knowledge we would gain from finding the origin of something, the origin of a word, doing etymology, for example, and finding the original meaning of a word, is worthless in telling us how that word has come to be viewed and what it means today. Okay, so they reject this idea of origins and of centers or basic structures. Okay, and so one of the thinkers you'll have is a guy by the name of is a French theorist by the name of Deleuze. And for example, he gives a good idea of this. But for the modernists, we look at structures. Binaries. So the work of in myth, this is carried out in large part by a lot of anthropologists such as Levi Strauss, who does work with what he calls binaries. And there's a terrific chapter in your book where you can read, and later you'll be kind of asked to read this, Oedipus Rex, and he does a structuralist analysis of Oedipus Rex. And in fact, oftentimes the word modernism is seen as a synonym for the word structuralism. Okay, so people like Levi Strauss in myth and and others, even Barthes to some degree as well, but so Joseph Campbell, um, Jung, all of these guys are basically structuralists. They're looking for that fundamental structure. And so back to Deleuze, with basically a structure is that you have a foundation and you build things on the foundation the way we think of a house, right? Deleuze came along, he came up with this idea that I think is a good symbol for what postmodernism is, which is what's something he called the rhizome. And the example he used was tree roots, right? There is no center, there's no central tree root. There's no fundamental essential tree root. This is just a mixture, right? And today it's easy to conceive of this rhizome idea because the internet. Okay, I can't unplug the internet anywhere. There's no center to it. There's no focal point to the internet. So and that's kind of the way postmodernists try to look at power structures and other things, right? So generally speaking, modernists tend, like in literary theory, modernists are people who tend to favor kind of a master narrative, whereas postmodernists are skeptical of master narratives, and they're skeptical too of the idea of science, of progress through the sciences, which the modernists weren't. They saw a clear kind of hierarchical structure and a clear kind of linear development pattern. So again, for postmodernists, the self isn't some structured, unified essence, as it is, say, with Carl Jung and his idea of individuation, but it's a fragmented and multiplicit and even conflicting identity. Um, and Postmodernists reject both family units and also other middle class marriage models in favor of kind of multiple identities for coupling and child raising and so forth. Um, and postmodernists also tend to trust and invest more in micropolitics, even identity politics sometimes, than in so-called big politics such as nation state or the party. So Marx, for example, is a structuralist. He found what the underlying structures of capitalism. Foucault, who studied under Marx, kind of took that in a different direction, said actually there's multiple sources of power that aren't necessarily rooted just in production as Marx had it. And we can talk about those things later. Okay. And so, in a nutshell, that's what modernism and postmodernism is. I will send you a link to read up a little bit more about these. And then in the announcements this week, I'm going to give you, like I said, each of you is going to I'm going to put you in, I'm going to couple you with one other student. And usually the way it works is one student takes one theorist and the other student takes the other, or one student is in charge of the PowerPoint and the other student is in charge of the research, or one student does the presenting, the other one does the writing. You can divide that how you see fit. Um, but let me know so that no one will lose points if their partner kind of doesn't do their fair share. You'll get credit for your part of it, regardless. So I will kind of give you the name of your partner, and maybe you guys can exchange emails or something, and we'll work all that throughout the discussions. And then each group is going to get two other or three other thinkers, and that's every group is going to have those. And basically, what you're looking for in the thinkers that the theorists that I give you, is not everything they have to say. That's too vast, and yeah, and even limiting it to what they have to say about myth or cultural hegemony, which is what we're doing, is still pretty darn broad. And that's why I'm going to fill in the blanks. Don't get anxious about this assignment. Just do your best. Because like I said, usually what we do is I have students present this in the class, and then I step in to kind of re-explain some things, correct information, and fill in the blanks and add a little bit more. Because we could easily spend a whole semester on any of these thinkers. So don't expect that you're going to be a master expert on any of them. So just do your best. And this kind of gives me some idea of what to push and what not to push. And it gives us kind of a general grounding of how we can use these theorists later in the semester to help support our own interpretations, and of the cultural hegemony and the meanings of these myths. Okay, and so how you do that, and again, I'll go over this in the introductions, not in introductions, in the announcements a little bit as well, but it's up to you. You can either write it all up and share it in that discussion. You can make a video of yourself or selves and present the material that way. You can do a PowerPoint. You can do all of the above and combine those, or combine two of those, or whatever. So it's up to you for how you want to present this. If you do a video or something, then I don't want it to be longer than 10 minutes. It should be at least 3, I would say, but no longer than 10 minutes. So that kind of gives you some idea of how thoroughly I want you to look into these theorists, which is to say, this isn't a major assignment. This isn't something you need to spend 5 or 6 hours researching. Just kind of dip your foot in the pond, as they say, and get a feel for the temperature and that sort of thing, I guess. So do that as you will, and I'll post that in the announcements. Actually, probably as you're watching this video, you'll see the announcement because I'll post them together. And as always, if you have questions, shoot me an email. If I can help you with the research at all, please let me know. I will do that in the discussions. I'm going to give you some key points for each theorist. In fact, I'll kind of review that right now. So basically, though, for the people whomever has Freud, for Freud, I want you to look at his idea of the id, ego, and superego, and how he defines the unconscious. As we've already seen a little bit, for Freud, the unconscious is myth. There, it's the unconscious are public dreams, right? And that's what myths are. And so those three things, and the id, ego, and superego, and how they interact with each other, are significant. And then finally, his theory of the Oedipal complex, and how that relates to those other ideas. And then with Deleuze, as already mentioned, his idea of the rhizome is important, and also his idea of society of control, right? So it's his take on Foucault's idea of biopower, and how he takes it from society of discipline to society of control. Okay, so for the group that gets Nietzsche and Foucault, for Nietzsche, I want you to look at his concepts of the Apollonian and of Apollonian and Dionysian myth. So these are two different ways of thinking and two different kinds of myths to embody that kind of thinking. And then also his idea of the myth of Zarathustra. Thus spake Zarathustra. What he's doing here is he's trying to generate his own myth that will speak to our time in particular. So why does he think Zarathustra is significant for doing that? He favors, for example, the use of myth to convey knowledge over science, and his Zarathustra is an example of that. And then finally, what's his critique of Judeo-Christian myth and Judeo-Christian thought? So those three things under Nietzsche. For Foucault, I want you to look look for his information about biopower and society of discipline, right? Um, the knowledge as genealogy might come into play as well, but it's those other two concepts that I'm most concerned about. And then next for Jung, Carl Jung, that's Jung. I want you, for the people who have Jung and James Hillman, for Jung, I want you to look up his idea of individuation and the archetype. And then Hillman uses those same concepts, except he doesn't use individuation, but he does use the archetype. But for him, it's polytheistic archetypes. So look up that word, the polytheistic archetypes, and then also look up you might look up his acorn theory as well. Okay, so those are the three groups, and then everyone I want you to look up information about Joseph Campbell and as the modernist mythologist. So those other thinkers don't always, in fact, most of them don't specifically deal with myth. They're either psychologists or philosophers, etc., dealing with issues of cultural hegemony. Now, some of them treated myths and so forth, and they're relevant in that way. But these last three are people that are specifically mythologists, and I want you to kind of see how the ideas of those previous six kind of are utilized by these thinkers. And one of those thinkers is Joseph Campbell. He's covered heavily in your textbook, as is Carl Jung, and fairly significantly Sigmund Freud as well. So your textbook will be helpful on that. But also there's a number of readings in the content folder that will be enormously helpful here as well, both modernism and postmodernism, but you'll also find each of those thinkers that I mentioned, you'll find information there. And then you can go beyond that and find other information as well. And then so Joseph Campbell's the modernist, and then modernist mythologists, that is, and then the other two are Karen Doniger and Bruce Lincoln. So Karen Doniger and Bruce Lincoln, how, describe their practice of studying mythology and how it's postmodern as opposed to the modernist study of mythology that we see from Joseph Campbell. Okay, so again, shoot me an email if you have any questions about any of this. But don't. Well, there's no point in saying don't email me until you've watched this video. But yeah, hopefully you've both watched the video and read the assignment, and then get in touch with me, and we can. But hopefully this video will answer a lot of the questions you have from the announcement and your assignment this week. And so your assignment this week will be basically to post your material and then to comment on at least on the other two groups that you weren't in, and so respond to those posts in that discussion tab. So thanks everyone, and we'll see you next week when we'll kind of have an open Zoom where you'll be able to talk to me directly if you so choose. So hope y'all have a good week. Ciao.